Hi, I'm Terrell Turner, and today we're going to be talking about something that's very important, and it's something that impacts very specific organizations, and it is churches. Now, whether you're a small church or whether you're a big church or whether you're a medium-sized church, these are common issues that I've seen. Now, my background is accounting and finance, and so when I'm looking at different organizations, I'm observing, and these are things that have stood out to me that I've seen happen in different types of organizations. So, but before we go into that, just to give you a little context on my background. So, my background, as I said, is accounting and finance. I'm a CPA. I spent years on doing financial accounting for various types of organizations. I spent some years doing audits of not-for-profit organizations. I have for-profit and I have not-for-profit and churches as clients of my firm. My firm is the TL Turner Group. In 2021, we were recognized in the New York Times. Actually, in that series, we were the only accounting firm that was recognized in that top 100 list. I'm also a 40 under 40 CPA, and we create tons of shows just like this one. We create free content to talk about different topics from a finance and accounting perspective. And today we're talking about churches. And the topic that we're talking about are three common church financial issues or finance issues. And these are areas where I've seen a lot of churches where they were trying to do the right thing, but because they maybe they just didn't know any better, that they had some issues in this. So let's just go ahead and jump into it. So the first one is the housing allowance. Now, this is an area where a lot of churches have gotten themselves into trouble because they didn't know how to, I guess you say, properly approach this. Now, when it comes down, just to give a little bit of context, when it comes down to a housing allowance, now, ministers that are, I guess on the ministerial staff provide ministerial services for a religious organization. The current tax code does allow that church to give that minister a housing allowance where that allowance or whatever that amount of money is, it can cover housing expenses, and that housing allowance money is not subject to taxes. So it becomes a very important, I guess you say a very interesting, I guess you say, indirect form of compensation. And it is something that's very common with a lot of churches, because most churches, they probably can't afford to pay or they're probably not going to have like this enormous salary, but they do have this as a optional benefit of being able to cover the housing costs of the ministers on staff. Now, where the issues start to come in is around how much I guess you say, how they approach giving the funds to the pastor. So where some of them I've seen have the issue is they had no formal approval of how much this housing allowance was going to be. Now, from the IRS's perspective, when it comes down to housing allowance, they don't necessarily state an exact dollar amount. They say, it has to be reasonable. And they also want to understand and know, was this amount approved by an advisory committee, a board? So one of the things that I tell churches is that you want to make sure that you have an advisory or a board meeting and that you actually document how much money did you approve for the ministers to receive as housing allowance. And you want to make sure you have that documented, and you want to make sure that you have it on file. And in that, you want to say, okay, all right, what board or what advisory committee approved it? You want the documentation to support it. You want, hey, this is how much we're paying them in normal compensation. This is how much we're paying them towards their housing allowance. And then also, hey, this is how often that housing allowance is being paid. Again, it's a phenomenal benefit that can be offered to ministers. But what you want to make sure is that you are documenting and you are recording it, and you have the approval documented from your board. Because if you don't have that, you could run into issues if you were to go through an audit. Now, the next one is when it comes down to being benevolent and taking care of some of the needs of the people in your organization, or maybe there's others that you're providing financial support for, one of the things you want to make sure that you are collecting is a form W-9. Now, this form W-9, what it does is it collects basic information about the person, like name, social security number, or EIN if they're an organization, and so forth. Because at the end of the year, when you are wrapping up your end of the year reporting, churches don't have to file a tax return, but you do have to process 1099. So if you have been giving anyone more than $600 in any given year, in the entire year, if you add it all up and you've given them more than $600, then the IRS does, in many cases, require a Form 1099 to be filed. Now, in order for you to file that Form 1099, you need the information that's on the W-9. So the best practice would be is before you actually hand that person the money, before you give them the money, ask them to fill out a Form W-9. And what you want to make sure is that you have this on file. And you want to do the same thing, even if you have contractors in your organization. You want to make sure you get this Form W-9 signed and filled out. And you want to make sure that you have this Form W-9 on file. So at the end of the year, when you're working with your accountant, that you can actually get the 1099 process in a timely fashion, because there is a deadline for 1099s. And then the last one that I want to cover, this one is a little bit of an interesting one, because this definitely comes up for a lot of churches, and it also comes up for for-profit organizations. And this is the proper classification of people who are involved in your church. Now, I left out volunteers, but volunteers are another subset of proper classification. But what I really want to focus on are the people that you are paying for their services, whether that be like the ministerial staff, or whether that is security, any different people that you may be paying for services related to the church organization and the operations of the church. Now, where a lot of people start to get this confused is they say, well, we don't really have employees. And they say, because we don't really consider them to be employees. Everybody's a contractor, and that's how we pay them. And I understand that may be the way that you want to approach it. But we do have to take a step back and realize that the IRS has a definition of what an employee is. They have criteria about who a contractor is. So you want to make sure that you are abiding by that. Now, just to give you a little bit of context, because I've gone through this in other videos and context, but just to give you a little bit of context on this is, one way to think about it is, and a person is an employee if the responsibilities that they uphold for the organization, if you as the organization, let's say the pastor, the minister, someone, I guess, with a official position at the organization, if that person reports to you, meaning they take their directions from you, you guide them, like, you're pretty much giving them their instructions on what to do, every aspect of it, every step of it, then that person would be considered more than likely an employee. Now, on the contractor side, if that person is, let's say they truly have their own business, what they are doing for the organization is purely governed by a contract. And that contract lays out what they will and won't do. Typically, that will fall under what you would call a contractor. And the reason why that becomes important is because employees, if you do have employees, then the employer, which is the organization, is responsible for paying payroll taxes. Now, if you have a contractor, the organization is not responsible for paying payroll taxes. And when you get this wrong, there could be IRS penalties involved if you don't get this right. So what you want to make sure that you do is you want to make sure that you get the classification of The people who you are paying, who are working in your organization, you want to make sure that you get that right. And so those are the three common things that I've seen is, go back to the first one. The first one is the housing allowance. Common issue. A lot of churches get that wrong. Also, look, collecting W-9s. If you are going to pay anyone, if the church organization is going to give anyone money, then you want to make sure that you're collecting a W-9 where that is applicable. And that's, hey, benevolence for contractors, like whether it's security team, anyone that you're paying that's not an employee, you want to get a form W-9. Now, if they're an employee, there's a different form you're going to get for that. And then the last one is making sure that you classify them properly. You want to make sure that you have that. Now, a lot of this can be resolved if you're working with a bookkeeper or an accountant that can really help you understand these and really understand the uniqueness of your specific church's situation, the specific transactions that you're doing. So you want to make sure that you have some good counsel that you can go to. And so I always advise churches is, you know what? I know it may be an investment, but you want to make sure that you have good counsel. And one of the things that I tell people is, even if it's just to hire someone just for a consulting basis, just to have them come in and do a review, because that's something that we do for several organizations where they just want a review. They don't necessarily need to hire us full time to do the bookkeeping and stuff like that, where we come in, we do a project-based review, we give them an assessment, and we say, hey, here's what we found, here's what our recommendations are. And then as you start to grow and your organization needs ongoing support, then maybe it is time for you to look to a bookkeeping solution where you bring in a bookkeeper who understands accounting for your type of organization. Now, one of the things that I definitely have to emphasize is make sure that they understand accounting for your type of organization, because that is going to be important, whether you want to do things like you want to get a loan to buy a building or buy a property, or you want to refinance. Your financial institution may require you to be working with someone who understands your organization and who understands accounting and finance. So those are the three critical areas where I've seen financial issues happen for churches. So definitely, thanks for tuning in.